You might be wondering how this tiny little D6 completely changed my game. Well, if you're not one of my players who are currently shaking in their boots at the mere sight of this little skull guy, then let me tell you why, and how doing the exact same thing can help enhance your game as well. So what's so scary about this D6? I mean, it's just a D6, right? Like, it has all the faces like a D6. It's just a 6-sided dice. What, because it's a skull? Is that why it's scary? It's spooky? Well, weirdly enough, that does tie into it a little bit, but not mainly the reason why. The main reason why this D6 is a symbol of fear at my table is because of dice clocks. Well, what's a dice clock? I don't see a clock on this guy. Well, you notice how there is 6 sides to it, and if you think about just time in general, how many minutes are in an hour? With that one hint, you've already cracked the puzzle. 60 minutes, 6-sided dice, 10-minute intervals. So why is that significant? Well, they also have another name. Dungeon clocks. In my game that I'm making called Sanctum, I really wanted to install like a hard and fast rule for dungeon delving and not just make a map and then you go through the map and then things happen in the dungeon map. I wanted it to be that and also bring forward for the GM, for the players, and just the feeling of the dungeon in general, how tense a dungeon crawl can be. But how do I do that with just a dice? Well, every time 10 minutes pass, or an activity is performed, which takes 10 minutes, funnily enough, you have to then tick the D6 down to a D5, and then to a D4, etc. And to clarify, this is whenever 10 minutes pass, or whenever you take an activity, not if you fail or succeed a roll, just whenever you do it. So every time you do something, you tick down the dice until it reaches 1, and then once it reaches 1 and you do another activity or cause a loud noise or something for your presence to be known in the dungeon for the other occupants to potentially hear you, or just you're messing around doing something, you then flicker up to the top back to a 6. And that's called resetting the dice. 60 minutes have passed, or you've caused enough ruckus in order for something to happen. But what happens then? You tick down to 1 and then it's back up to 6 and what? Well, you then make a roll, but what kind of roll depends on the difficulty of the dungeon. This is more of a Sanctum thing than a D&D game, but you could try and work it into D&D if you like. But with Sanctum, everything is based on this easy, medium, hard, and extreme difficulty range. And as the GM sends you into a dungeon, they have to consider what difficulty this dungeon is. And that's because you have to roll on a table, and the table ranges from 1 to 4 is nothing, 5 to 6 to 7 is an encounter, and an 8+ is a combat. If it's a more easy dungeon, you have to roll a d6, which means you get that range of 1 to 4 is nothing, or 5 to 6 is an encounter. But if it's a medium or hard or extreme dungeon, the dice increases in size. So a medium dungeon is a D8, a hard dungeon is a D10, and an extreme dungeon is a D12. And that range of 1 to 4, 5 to 7, and 8+ stays the same. So if you're in even just a medium dungeon, that risk of an extra combat increases by a little bit if you roll an 8. But a hard or extreme dungeon, suddenly that's an 8, 9, 10 for a D10, or an 8, 9, 10, 12, 11 for a D12. And listen, before you jump into the comment section to say that dice clocks aren't a thing that you made up, other games do this. I'm fully aware. They do this and it's great. What I'm saying is, you need to do it in your game too. And I'm not saying you have to, but bonus points if you have a D6, which is particularly noteworthy for the occasion. And now we're getting into it, because you see how this guy is indeed a skull. He is a big D6, quite visible on a table, and also quite chunky compared to other D6s. Well, when it's time for a dungeon or another encounter that would require a restriction of time, you then go, right guys, so, anything you want to do before you step in? Cool. And place down the dice, showing the D6. You will hear that and go, okay, cool, you explained the whole D6 thing, how it works, it's the tick down, but my players, they have seen this happen so many times, where they were going to go into a dungeon, and then the dreaded dice comes out. In fact, do you know how the meme for DMs or GMs, whatever it is that if you don't stop messing around, I'm going to bring out this super powerful monster, whether it's the Tarrasque or whatever it is. For me, I don't have to do that. I just show them little Bert here. And you might be thinking, why do I sit and try to install fear into my players? Why do I make it so that a dungeon crawl is just every action we take makes us slowly creep towards doom? Well, Isn't that the point of a dungeon? Your immediate answer might be, no, the point of a dungeon is to crawl through an enclosed space, fight some monsters, get some loot, and get out. But if you want things to be epic, tense, really feel like you're delving into a place unknown, scary, the lair of another creature, where there are bandits, minions, and of course, a dark, treasure-hoarding dragon or other sort of monster lurking at the final room, and every action you take is just one more step down into this gullet until you reach the stomach, trying to cut out its heart before it swallows you whole. And if that isn't the appeal of a dungeon, then I don't know what your dungeons are like. They sound like just other encounters but we're underground now. I much prefer dungeons that feel like a puzzle. Like, there'll be puzzles in them, yes, there'll be combat and there'll be traps, the usual antics, but if the whole dungeon itself feels like a slow creep in the pitch dark with only your torch or your limited dark vision to guide you, then that is what I want. A thing that borders on the line between adventure and existential horror. To give you an example of what I mean, if you get this dice and it ticks down to 1 and it goes up to 6 again, you then have to roll on the dungeon encounter table, which is that thing I mentioned before, which is 1 to 4, 5 to 7, 8 plus. But you have to choose, well, the GM has to choose, what kind of dungeon it is. Like, they've chose the difficulty, they've probably populated it, but they have to choose the theme of the dungeon. The themes that the GM can choose from are mundane, magical, lair, and planar intrusion. So let's say our boy ticks down to 1 and goes back up to 6, you then roll the dice, oh no, I got an encounter. Guess I'll have to pick this d6 up again, because each of the themes has a table with 6 results on it. Let's say that the GM chose the mundane dungeon, which sounds boring, but it's not. Think of it like the caves or the bandit hideouts sort of dungeon. The sort of low level tier, but maybe even high level tier. Not much is going on, but there's terrifying stuff on the inside. So, you roll your d6, cast it down, oh, I got a 4, which might be a ceiling tile falls on your head and makes you dizzy for an hour. Maybe it's a pet or just another animal in this dungeon, sees you, starts yelping and runs off into the dungeon to either warn its owners or just to run away, causing even more noise. Very devious, but let's say that the GM chose the magical dungeon theme. In that case, it might be owned by a mad wizard, or it was once owned long ago by a magical school, like Hogwarts. As for the encounters, there's one that does damage, which feels typical of a dungeon, but my favourite one, because it's so subtly devious, is all of the doors in the dungeon lock. Let me repeat. All of the doors, all of them, in the dungeon lock. That seems fine. Maybe you have a thief-like character who can unlock those doors and, you know, maybe someone brought some lockpicks, but if they don't, or maybe they have no lockpicks or any means to get through these doors, well then they're gonna have to break them down. And if you break down a dungeon, it causes the die to tick. So even after resetting the dice and going up to a 6, you then have to break down the door to get it down to a 5. And if the next door's locked, which it is because they're all locked, it goes down to a 4, increasing how quickly the dice ticks down. And that's not to mention, if you're being chased out of the dungeon, as you run you realise all the doors before that point are locked. All this fun and chaos, all this resource management, all this dread as you think, can we even afford to try and look for health potions while we're damaged? Can we even try to do this and that? Because what if we get attacked in the dungeon? All of this happening while the dungeon is pitch black, choking dust and cobwebs. Noises from everywhere, constantly dripping you in dread and fear. All of this happening because of a tiny d6. And also, I have to admit, all this came about because I looked at this thing after buying it and thought, I'm gonna have to do something with this. This is awesome. Little skull die, the die of doom I'll call it. But what can I attach to that? Oh, a whole game system for dungeon delving, cool. Also, to drive the mechanic home, I would totally get one of these dice. Maybe not an exact, it doesn't have to be a skull, but like an equally foreboding dice. A dice that you can just place on the table and say, okay, things are going down, because now the players know. Every 10 minutes that pass, they have to be efficient with time. Every loud noise we create, we have to be careful and quiet. Every action we take, we have to be conservative in this dark, choking, clawing darkness of a dungeon. trying to be as careful as you can in order to not hasten your own demise. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, then please leave a comment down below telling me what props and techniques that you guys use to enhance the fear or just the overall awesomeness of your game. Also, click that video at the top if you want more tips on how to run a great dungeon, or that video at the bottom if you want to hear about my game that I'm making called Sanctum. I love you all, and I'll see you next time.